June 6, 1944. The sun came up over Juno Beach on the coast of Normandy, France. Inside thick concrete bunkers looking out over the gray water, German officers stood at their lookout posts with coffee in their hands. Some were smiling. Others were actually laughing. Through their special viewing glasses, they watched the dark shapes of ships gathering far away on the water. Hundreds of boats. The attack everyone knew was coming had finally arrived. A German major put down his viewing glasses and turned to his fellow officers. "The Canadians," he said with a mean smile. "They're sending the Canadians." The other men laughed. One lieutenant shook his head like he couldn't believe it. These weren't the battle-tested American Rangers. These weren't the tough British commandos. These were farm boys from the colonies. Tree cutters and wheat farmers playing soldier. The Germans had faced real armies before. This would be nothing. The German 716th Infantry Division had spent months turning Juno Beach into a fortress. They called it part of the Atlantic Wall. Huge concrete bunkers held 85mm artillery guns that could blow apart landing boats from 2 miles away. Machine gun positions sat every 100 yards along the beach. MG-42 machine guns that fired 200 bullets per minute. They called them Hitler's buzz saws because of the sound they made when ripping through men like cloth. Below the water, engineers had planted thousands of wooden posts topped with mines. Steel spikes designed to tear the bottoms out of boats. Rolls of sharp, barbed wire stretched across every path off the beach. The Germans had 3,000 soldiers dug into positions they'd been making stronger since 1942. Facing them were 14,000 Canadian troops packed into landing boats, now bouncing through rough seas. The 3rd Canadian Infantry Division, units with names that sounded like they came from small prairie towns, because they did. The Royal Winnipeg Rifles. The Regina Rifle Regiment. The Queen's Own Rifles of Canada. Young men from Saskatchewan and Manitoba and Ontario. Many had never seen combat. Their officers were professional soldiers, yes. But the regular troops, these were the sons of farmers and miners and fishermen. Men who'd left their wheat fields and logging camps to put on uniforms. The German commanders knew this. Intelligence reports told them the Canadians were not frontline troops. Not like the divisions hitting other beaches. They'll panic. One German captain said to his men that morning, "When those ramps drop and they see what's waiting, they'll freeze. Farm boys don't charge into machine gun fire. They go home crying for their mothers." What the Germans didn't know was that these Canadians had already tasted failure. 2 years earlier, in August 1942, Canadian forces had attacked the French port of Dieppe. It was a disaster. More than 900 Canadians killed in just 9 hours. Another 2,000 captured. The Germans had killed them on the beaches. The Canadians who survived that nightmare had learned brutal lessons. Lessons written in the blood of their friends. Never hesitate. Never stop moving forward. Speed and violence win beach attacks. Not caution. Not hesitation. The survivors of Dieppe had spent 2 years training the new soldiers, teaching them that close fighting is won by whoever acts first and fastest. That a man who spent his life lifting hay bales and wrestling cattle had the strength and toughness for this kind of fighting. That farm boys who'd worked 18-hour days in -30-degree winters knew more about pushing through pain than most soldiers ever would. But the Germans in their bunkers saw none of this. They saw colonial troops, second-rate forces. They'd heard the Canadians were polite, peaceful people from a quiet country. This is not the Eastern Front. One German major told his men. These are not Russian soldiers who fight like animals. These are soft boys from across the ocean. We'll send them back to their farms in body bags. At 7:25 in the morning, the landing boats were supposed to hit the beach. But the seas were rough, 8-foot waves. Some boats were taking on water. The attack ran 10 minutes late. Those 10 extra minutes gave German gunners more time to spot targets, more time to adjust their aim, more time to prepare. The officers in the bunkers watched the approaching boats and felt confident. Everything was going according to plan. Their plan. Inside the landing boats, Canadian soldiers were packed shoulder to shoulder, soaking wet from sea spray. Some were seasick. Most were terrified. They'd been told what to expect. They knew half of them might not make it off the beach. They'd seen the photos from planes of the German defenses. They knew about deep. But something else lived in these men too. Something the Germans couldn't see through their viewing glasses. A quiet determination. The same stubbornness that made their grandfathers break prairie grass with hand plows. The same toughness that got their fathers through the Great Depression. These weren't soft men. They were hard men from a hard land who'd learned young that complaining never fixed anything. Work did. Action did. As the landing boat engines roared toward shore, one Canadian sergeant major named Charlie Martin checked his rifle one more time. Around him, farm boys from Winnipeg gripped their weapons with white knuckles. Behind them, more boats carried farm boys from Regina, from Toronto, from fishing villages in Nova Scotia. Thousands of young Canadians who'd crossed an ocean to fight men, who thought they were a joke. The Germans were about to discover something terrible. Something that would shatter their confidence in less than an hour. They were about to learn that the most dangerous thing in war is underestimating your enemy. Especially when that enemy has something to prove. The steel ramp slammed down at 7:35. What happened next would haunt German officers for the rest of their lives. The Canadians didn't freeze. They didn't hesitate. They poured out of those boats and ran straight into the teeth of the German defenses. Machine gun fire tore through the first waves of men like a blade through wheat. The Queen's Own Rifles of Canada hit the beach at Bernarez. Within the first 3 minutes, half of the men in the lead company were dead or wounded. Bodies dropped in the surf. The water turned red. The sound was deafening. Machine guns roaring. Artillery shells exploding. Men screaming. The metallic smell of blood mixed with smoke and salt water and diesel fuel from burning vehicles. But the Canadians kept coming. This was the first shock for the Germans. These men didn't go to ground. They didn't hide behind the beach obstacles. They ran forward. If a man fell, the man behind him kept running. They'd learned at deep that stopping on a beach meant death. The only way to survive was to get off that beach as fast as possible. Get to the bunkers. Get to the guns. Kill the gunners. Or die trying. There was no middle ground. The Royal Winnipeg Rifles landed at Courceuls facing concrete pillboxes and houses turned into fortresses. A German MG-42 machine gun position was cutting down Canadians as they left their boats. Sergeant Major Charlie Martin saw 6 of his men fall in seconds. He grabbed a Bren gun, a light machine gun, and ran straight at the German position. Bullets kicked up sand around his feet. He didn't stop. He got close enough to throw a grenade through the firing hole of the bunker. The explosion silenced the gun. Other Canadians saw this and followed his example. They'd spent 2 years training for exactly this kind of fighting. Fast. Brutal. No hesitation. The Germans had expected the Canadians to use standard attack tactics. Establish a beachhead. Call in naval fire support. Wait for reinforcements. Move carefully. But these Canadians fought like men possessed. They used tactics the Germans had never seen. Small teams of 5 or 6 men would rush a bunker from multiple sides at once. Some would lay down covering fire, while others got close enough to use flamethrowers. The flamethrowers were terrible weapons that shot streams of burning liquid. When fire poured into a concrete bunker, the men inside had 2 choices: burn alive or run out and surrender. Most chose surrender. The Canadians also had special tanks that the Germans hadn't prepared for. Sherman grabbed tanks that had spinning chains on the front to explode mines. AVRE tanks that fired 40-pound bombs that could blow apart concrete walls. DD tanks that could swim to shore and provide covering fire. These machines, combined with infantry who wouldn't stop advancing, created a system the Germans couldn't counter fast enough. The Canadian plan was simple but effective. Tanks blast the bunkers. Infantry rushes in during the confusion. Clear the position. Move to the next one. Don't stop. Never stop. Within 90 minutes of landing, the Royal Winnipeg Rifles had completely cleared the town of Courseulles. 90 minutes. German commanders had guessed it would take 4 to 6 hours if the Canadians even managed it at all. In his command bunker, German officers listened to radio reports with growing disbelief. "They're not stopping," one company commander radioed. "They just keep coming. We kill them and more keep coming." Another officer reported that Canadian troops were already 3 miles inland. 3 miles. The plan called for the Allies to secure the beach on D-Day and maybe push a mile or 2 inland, if everything went perfectly. The Canadians were ahead of schedule and showed no signs of slowing down. The farm boy toughness that Germans had mocked was now breaking their defensive line. These young Canadians had grown up doing hard physical work in brutal conditions. Hauling hay bales in summer heat, working in -40-degree cold during prairie winters, handling frightened animals twice their size. They were used to pain, used to exhaustion, used to finishing a job no matter how hard it got. When a German counterattack hit them, they didn't break. They dug in and fought back with the same stubborn determination they'd used to plow frozen fields back home. The Regina Rifle Regiment faced similar resistance at their landing zone. Heavy casualties in the first wave. German guns sweeping the beach. But they pushed through. One company commander, Major Duncan Grosh, led his men in clearing a series of fortified houses. They went room to room, floor to floor, throwing grenades, firing rifles, using bayonets when they ran out of ammunition. By 10:00 in the morning, they had pushed inland toward the village of Rivières. The contrast with other beaches was stark. At Omaha Beach, American forces were pinned down and taking terrible casualties. They would fight all day just to secure the beach itself. The British at Gold Beach were making good progress but moving carefully. Only the Canadians at Juno were punching through German defenses so quickly that Allied command couldn't believe the reports. By noon, all the beach exits at Juno were in Canadian hands. They controlled every path off the sand, every road into the interior. The German 716th Infantry Division was falling apart. German commanders began sending desperate messages to headquarters. They needed reinforcements. They needed the 12th SS Panzer Division. They needed tanks and fresh troops. The Canadians are breaking through. The messages said. We cannot hold them. Officers who'd been laughing 6 hours earlier were now watching their defensive plans collapse. These weren't farm boys playing soldier. These were soldiers who happened to be farm boys. And that combination made them more dangerous than the Germans had imagined possible. The weapons and tactics were one thing. The Sherman tanks and the flamethrowers and the naval gunfire support. But what really broke the German defense was something simpler. The Canadians wouldn't quit. A German soldier could shoot a Canadian and watch him fall, but 3 more would keep coming. A bunker could hold off one attack, but the Canadians would attack again and again and again until that bunker was silent. The Germans were facing men who'd been taught from childhood that you don't stop working until the job is done. You don't quit because it's hard. You finish what you start. By 2:00 in the afternoon, Canadian troops were 7 miles inland, farther than any other Allied force except the British on Gold Beach. The farm boys had torn a hole in Hitler's Atlantic Wall, and they were still moving forward. In just 5 hours, Juno Beach transformed from an unbreakable German fortress into a secure Allied foothold. The statistics told a story that German high command didn't want to believe. Before the invasion, the Germans held every inch of beach, every bunker, every gun position. They had 3,000 troops in fortified positions they'd spent 2 years building. By early afternoon on June 6th, those positions were destroyed or abandoned. The Canadians controlled the entire beach and were pushing deeper into France than almost anyone else. The Atlantic Wall, which Hitler had promised was unbreakable, had been shattered by men the Germans thought were amateurs. The beach itself was a vision of chaos and destruction. Burning landing boats sat half underwater in the surf, black smoke pouring into the gray sky. Destroyed German bunkers leaked concrete dust and the sharp smell of explosives. Abandoned weapons littered the sand, helmets, rifles, machine guns still pointing at the water, but with no one left to fire them. The sound was constant and overwhelming. Diesel engines from tanks, boots crunching on sand and gravel, officers shouting orders, the crack of rifles from inland where fighting continued, wounded men calling for medics, the metallic clang of equipment being unloaded from ships, and underneath it all, the endless crash of waves against a beach that would never be the same. German officers who'd been so confident that morning were now sending panicked radio messages to headquarters. One transmission was picked up by Allied intelligence. The Canadians are fighting like demons. The German commander reported, "They show no fear. They will not stop. We need immediate reinforcements or this entire sector will collapse." Another message was even more desperate. "These are not the soldiers we were told to expect. These men are highly trained and extremely aggressive. They are fighting with a skill level we did not prepare for." The numbers painted a clear picture. By the end of day, 21,400 Canadian troops had landed at Juno Beach. They suffered 174 casualties. That included 340 men killed. These were heavy losses. Higher than expected. But compared to what they'd accomplished, the breakthrough was extraordinary. German forces lost an estimated 1,000 men killed or wounded with hundreds more captured. More importantly, they lost their defensive positions. Lost their confidence. Lost any belief that they could push the Canadians back into the sea. The Canadians had moved farther inland than any Allied force except the British at Gold Beach. While American troops at Omaha were still fighting to secure the beach itself, Canadians were in the village of Bretteville, Orgueillus, 7 to 8 miles from the coast. They'd linked up with British forces from Gold Beach, creating a unified front that the Germans couldn't break. The gap between the two beaches was closed. The Allied foothold in France was secure. But the Germans weren't done fighting. On June 7th, the elite 12th SS Panzer Division launched a massive counterattack. These weren't regular army troops. These were Hitler's best. Young, fanatical soldiers who'd been trained since childhood to believe in Nazi beliefs. They had Tiger and Panther tanks. The best armor Germany could build. They hit the Canadian positions at the villages of Authie and Buron with everything they had. The goal was simple. Smash through the Canadian line. Push them back to the beach. Destroy the invasion before it could grow stronger. The Canadians were outnumbered and outgunned. The German tanks were heavier and more powerful than anything the Canadians had. But the Canadians had already proven something important. They didn't break under pressure. When the German tanks rolled toward them, Canadian anti-tank crews held their positions. They waited until the panzers were close. Then they fired. Some tanks exploded. Others were damaged and retreated. Infantry fighting followed. House-to-house combat in the narrow streets of Norman villages. Grenades thrown through windows. Machine gun fire from second-story rooms. Brutal close fighting where courage mattered more than equipment. A German commander, named Kurt Meyer, led part of the counterattack. He was a decorated officer who'd fought in Poland, France, and Russia. He'd seen combat in 3 different wars. After the battle, he was reported to have said, "These are not the soldiers we expected." The Canadians held their ground. They gave up some territory in the villages, but they didn't collapse. They didn't retreat in panic. They formed new defensive lines and stopped the German advance cold. For 2 days, the battle raged. By June 8th, the German counterattack had failed. The 12th SS Panzer Division was forced to pull back, having accomplished nothing except adding to their casualty lists. The fighting left the Norman villages looking like scenes from hell. Stone houses were reduced to rubble. Churches that had stood for centuries had their walls blown apart. The streets were cratered from artillery shells. Dead horses lay next to destroyed carts. The smell of death hung over everything. Decomposing bodies. Burning wood and rubber. Smoke that made eyes water and throats burn. Canadian soldiers who'd been farm boys 3 years ago now fought among the wreckage with the grim efficiency of veterans. They'd learned fast. Learned that war meant doing terrible things to survive. Learned that hesitation got you killed. The German decision to send the 12th SS Panzer Division against the Canadians had major consequences. Those tanks and troops were elite reserves meant to counterattack wherever the invasion seemed weakest. By throwing them at the Canadian sector, the Germans exposed other parts of their defense. They had to shift forces away from other areas. This meant American and British troops in other sectors faced less resistance. The Canadian breakthrough forced the Germans to fight on multiple fronts at once. They couldn't concentrate their armor in one place for a decisive counterattack. The plan to throw the Allies back into the sea became impossible. By mid-June, the Canadian sector of the Normandy front was never seriously threatened again. The Germans tried smaller attacks. They shelled Canadian positions with artillery. They sent patrol units to look for weaknesses. But they never again attempted a major offensive against the Canadians. The reason was simple. It cost too much and accomplished too little. German commanders learned to respect and fear Canadian units. Intelligence reports started marking Canadian positions with special warnings. Expect fierce resistance. These troops will not surrender positions easily. The physical conditions the Canadians endured during those first weeks were beyond brutal. The Norman summer was cold and wet. Rain turned fields into mud. Soldiers spent days soaked to the skin, sleeping in foxholes that filled with water. They ate cold rations because hot food drew artillery fire. They went days without sleep because the Germans attacked at night. Lice infested their uniforms. Their feet rotted from being constantly wet. They watched friends die from sniper fire or random artillery shells. And through it all, they kept fighting. Kept pushing forward. Kept taking one village after another. The beach where German officers had laughed on the morning of June 6th was now a massive supply depot. Thousands of tons of equipment flowed across Juno every day. The blood-soaked sand was covered with temporary roads made from metal mesh. Trucks rolled inland carrying ammunition, food, fuel, and reinforcements. The bunkers where Germans had mocked Canadian troops now served as Allied command posts and aid stations. In less than 2 weeks, Juno Beach went from a killing ground to a lifeline. And it never would have happened if the farm boys had been what the Germans expected them to be. The 3rd Canadian Infantry Division didn't stop at Juno Beach. They kept fighting through the entire Northwest Europe campaign. From Normandy to the Netherlands to Germany itself. For 11 months, they pushed forward. They helped liberate France village by village. They fought through Belgium in the fall of 1944. They endured the brutal winter battles in the Netherlands, where they cleared German troops from flooded lowlands. They crossed into Germany in early 1945 and fought until Hitler was dead and the war in Europe was over. By the time they came home, these men had seen more combat than most soldiers experience in 3 wars. The reputation of Canadian forces was forever changed by what happened at Juno Beach. Before D-Day, military planners saw Canadian troops as competent but unremarkable, good soldiers but not elite. After D-Day, that view shifted completely. German intelligence reports from later in the war show a dramatic change in how they describe Canadian units. Documents marked Canadian forces in sector became warnings that meant expect determined resistance and high casualties. German commanders learned to avoid fighting Canadians if they had any other option. The farm boys from the quiet country had become some of the most feared assault troops in the Allied armies. The success at Juno Beach was one of the most impressive Allied achievements on D-Day when measured against objectives. The Canadians were given a list of goals for the first day. Secure the beach. Clear the coastal defenses. Push inland and capture key villages. Link up with British forces. Every single objective was met. In fact, they exceeded expectations by pushing almost twice as far inland as planners thought possible. While other beaches saw mixed results, Juno was an unqualified success. The cost was high, but the results were undeniable. When the war ended in May 1945, the veterans began coming home. They returned to farms in Saskatchewan and Manitoba, to fishing villages in Nova Scotia, to small towns across Canada where everyone knew everyone. They hung up their uniforms and went back to their old lives. Most of them never talked about what they'd done. This was common among combat veterans. The memories were too painful, too personal. They'd seen friends die. They'd killed men. They'd experienced things that civilians couldn't understand. So they stayed quiet. They went back to plowing fields and fixing tractors and working in mines. They got married, raised families, became the quiet pillars of their communities. Charlie Martin, the sergeant major who'd thrown grenades into German bunkers on D-Day, returned to his life in Canada. He rarely spoke about the war. When people asked, he'd give short answers and change the subject. This was true for thousands of Canadian veterans. They didn't want parades or recognition. They wanted to forget. They wanted to move on. But they carried those experiences with them forever. The friends they'd lost. The things they'd seen. The person they'd been forced to become in order to survive. The military lessons from Juno Beach spread throughout Allied forces. The aggressive tactics the Canadians used became standard training for beach assaults. The combination of specialized tanks and fast, moving infantry became the model for future amphibious operations. Military academies studied what happened at Juno to understand why it worked so well. The answer kept coming back to the same factors: speed, aggression, refusal to stop moving forward, and troops who were physically and mentally tough enough to execute that plan under the worst conditions imaginable. But there was another lesson buried in the Juno Beach story. A lesson about assumptions and prejudice. The German officers who laughed that morning were professional soldiers. They'd been trained in the best military academies in Europe. They'd fought in multiple wars. They had years of experience. And yet, they made a fatal mistake. They assumed that men from farms and small towns couldn't be elite soldiers. They confused peaceful with weak. They thought rural backgrounds meant poor training. They were wrong on every count. The farm boys brought skills that military training couldn't teach. Problem: solving learned from years of fixing broken equipment. Physical toughness from daily hard labor. Mental resilience from enduring harsh weather and difficult conditions. Team coordination from working with family and neighbors to bring in harvest. These weren't weaknesses. They were strengths. Modern Canadian forces trace much of their identity back to D-Day and Juno Beach. New recruits learn about what happened on June 6, 1944. They're taught that Canadian soldiers have a reputation to uphold, a tradition of toughness and determination that was earned in blood on a French beach 80 years ago. The units that fought at Juno still exist today. The Royal Winnipeg Rifles, the Regina Rifles, the Queen's Own Rifles. They carry battle honors from Normandy. They remember the men who didn't come home. Yet, despite the significance of Juno Beach, the story is often overshadowed in popular culture. American movies and documentaries focus on Omaha Beach and the U.S. experience. British productions highlight their own forces. The Canadian contribution gets mentioned but rarely explored in depth. Many people around the world don't know that Canadians landed on D-Day at all. They don't know about the breakthrough at Juno. They don't know about the farm boys who proved everyone wrong. This lack of recognition bothers some veterans, though most would never say so. They did their job. That's what mattered to them. The philosophical lesson from Juno Beach goes beyond military tactics or national pride. It's about the danger of underestimating people based on surface judgments. The German officers saw young men from farms and assumed they lacked the killer instinct needed for war. They saw a peaceful country and assumed its soldiers would be soft. They confused different with inferior. This kind of arrogance has destroyed armies throughout history. It happens when professionals become so confident in their expertise that they stop seeing clearly. They stop asking hard questions. They make assumptions based on stereotypes rather than facts. And then reality proves them catastrophically wrong. This lesson applies far beyond battlefields. In business, established companies often dismiss new competitors as amateurs who don't understand the industry until those amateurs change the entire game. Experts overlook athletes from small schools or unusual backgrounds until those athletes prove the experts didn't know what they were looking for. In science, revolutionary ideas get dismissed by establishment figures who can't imagine the old ways being wrong until evidence forces them to accept new truth. The pattern repeats across every human endeavor. Arrogance blinds us to capability we don't expect to find. Today, Juno Beach has memorials and museums. Tourists walk the sand where Canadians fought and died. They see the remains of German bunkers. They read plaques that explain what happened. Every year, fewer veterans are alive to attend remembrance ceremonies. Soon, none will remain. The living memory will fade. All that will remain are the stories and the lessons. The story of farm boys who became warriors. The lesson that you dismiss your enemy at your peril. The reminder that toughness and skill come in forms you might not recognize until it's too late. On June 6, 1944, German officers learned that lesson the hardest way possible. They learned it from young Canadians who'd crossed an ocean to prove that where you come from matters far less than what you're made of inside. If you found this story powerful, please like this video and subscribe to our channel for more incredible stories from history. Share this with someone who needs to hear about courage and determination. What do you think made these farm boys so successful? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and remember, never underestimate someone based on where they come from.